The Winds of Winter by Sandra Field. Chapter 1. Anne Metcalfe left the hospital by the side door, buttoning up her coat as she went. The ice-cold wind nipped her fingers, and she fumbled for her gloves. "Afternoon, Miss Metcalfe." She looked up and smiled at the commissionaire. "Hi, Mr. Soames. Brr, isn't it cold?" "It is that. Winter's here to stay, I'm afraid. Too cold to be without a hat." She wrinkled her nose at him, amused by his avuncular attitude. He was a favorite of all the nurses. "I was late for work this morning, so I forgot it." "Tch, tch. Well, have a nice lunch, miss." He raised his gloved hand in salute, his faded blue eyes lingering appreciatively on the rich brown hair that tumbled over her collar, and on the delicate beauty of her features. Lovely girl, Miss Metcalfe, but sad-looking, somehow. He'd often wondered why, but there was something about her that made it impossible to ask. Anne walked quickly down the driveway to the main road, pulling her collar up around her ears. Mr. Soames was right. It was too cold to be without a hat. He was a dear, and she had noticed how he, like nearly all of her colleagues at the hospital, called her Miss Metcalfe rather than Mrs. Metcalfe. Other than the nursing superintendent, very few knew of her brief, disastrous marriage. She shivered from more than the cold, and deliberately began thinking about her theatre date with Jonathan tonight. She would wear the long, dark green skirt and the new blouse she had bought last week. Within a few minutes, she had walked across the park to join the lunch-hour crowds on the sidewalks of Spring Garden Road. Perhaps because it was a cold day, or perhaps because she had woken up with what she called the January blues, she suddenly decided to treat herself today. Rather than her usual rushed sandwich and coffee at a lunch counter, she would go to Pierre's and have something a little special. She pushed open the door of the restaurant and went into the foyer. A cheerful log fire burned in the fireplace, and there was a twinkle of candles on the red-checked tablecloths. There was also a lineup of people waiting to be seated. Well, she had an hour. As she waited, she amused herself by studying the occupants of the nearest tables, until she came to a small corner table by the fire. There was a girl seated there alone, reading a magazine with an intense concentration that immediately struck a chord in Anne's memory. Of course, it was Marianne Winters, her old friend of nursing school days. Impetuously, she left the queue and threaded her way among the tables. "Hi, Marianne, remember me?" The girl looked up, and Anne smiled to herself. The same curly brown hair and madcap green eyes, the same dimpled cheeks. She waited for the well-remembered sparkle of Marianne's smile, a smile that had led more than one serious-minded intern into trouble. But Marianne, far from smiling, was looking distinctly puzzled. I'm sorry, should I remember you?" Anne's jaw dropped. "It's Anne. Well, I'm Anne Metcalfe now, but I was Anne Brown when I first knew you. We were students together in Montreal." "Anne?" Marianne gazed at the other girl with something approaching consternation. Why, it is. Goodness, I didn't recognize you at all." Belatedly recalling her manners, she added, "Please, sit down and join me." As Anne slipped out of her coat and deposited her handbag on the floor, she could still sense the bewilderment in her friend's face. "Have I changed that much?" she asked, half-jokingly. "Yes, you have. I could have passed you in the street and not known you." "Well, it's been, 4 or 5 years since we've seen each other? I left Montreal right after you left nursing school to get married, so it's 5 years. It seems a long time ago, doesn't it?" "Yes," Anne said shortly, tracing a pattern on the tablecloth with her fingernail, and beginning to wonder if it had been a good idea to make herself known to her old friend again. She was glad of the diversion when the waitress arrived to take their orders. But Marianne had not been deflected. "What on earth are you doing down here? And how's David?" There was a little silence. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" Marianne asked gently. For all her impetuous ways, she had always been sensitive to the troubles of others. It was one of her most endearing traits. "Yes." Anne looked up, meeting the other girl's gaze with bleak grey eyes. "I'm working at the General Hospital, men's surgical ward. I took my final year of training here in Halifax and then went right to work afterwards. That's 3 days ago now." "And David?" "David and I don't live together anymore." "Oh dear, I am sorry." Marianne patted the other girl's hand. "But didn't I hear that you were pregnant?" "Yes," Anne replied in a low voice. "The baby died." There was genuine distress in Marianne's green eyes. "There's nothing much I can say, is there, except how dreadfully sorry I am. Was it very bad?" "Yes, it was very bad." Bravely, Anne raised her head. "But it's over now, and I try not to think about it too much. What's the use, after all?" "Are you divorced?" "No." Do you see David at all?" "I haven't laid eyes on him since the baby was born, and I don't want to." "But Anne, surely one day you'll want to remarry. You're far too gorgeous to stay in limbo forever. If you and David are really finished, isn't the sensible thing to get a divorce? And then get on with a new life?" It all sounded too reminiscent of what Jonathan had suggested on more than one occasion. "I suppose I should, but I don't think I could bear to see David again, or to get in touch with him." "You're still in love with him?" Anne blinked in surprise. "No, of course not. The exact opposite, in fact. I hate him, and I hate what he did to me. That's why I never want to see him again." "Oh." Marianne digested this for a minute. "Obviously he's not interested in remarrying, or he'd have been in touch with you." This aspect had never really occurred to Anne before. "I suppose you're right. Mind you, he has no idea where I am." The waitress put 2 steaming tureens of French onion soup in front of them, and a basket of hot rolls on the table. Absently buttering her bread, Anne gave a bitter little laugh. "Why should I remarry anyway? He always got what he wanted from women without resorting to marriage." "Was that the problem? Other women, I mean?" "Oh, one of them." Anne smiled wryly, although the smile did not reach her eyes. "I'm sure you don't want to hear the whole sad story behind my marriage breakup. It's over now and in the past, and I'm starting to enjoy life in Halifax. I like my job, and I'm making new friends. So let's talk about you for a change. What have you been up to since I saw you last?" Although it was fairly obvious that Marianne's curiosity was not satisfied, it was equally obvious that Anne had changed the subject. "Well, after listening to you, I hardly like to say this, but—" A tender little smile played around Marianne's lips. "I'm getting married next week, and we're emigrating to Australia." "Marianne, how lovely. Tell me all about him." "He's a doctor. I always did have a weakness for the medical profession, didn't I? His name's Jim Blanchard. He's 29, tall, dark, and handsome, and he loves me to distraction." Marianne looked so pleased with herself that Anne couldn't help laughing. "I think that's marvelous. Congratulations. But I'm sorry you're leaving just when we've met again." "So am I. It's pure chance we ran into each other. I had no idea you were here. I worked in Friedrichston for the last 2 days as a children's nurse at a daycare center. I'm only in Halifax for this last week. Jim's parents live here, and I'm staying with them. When Jim got the offer of this terrific job with the Flying Doctor Service, his uncle is one of the directors, he felt he couldn't turn it down. It's only for a 2-year term, and then I expect we'll come home again. Canada, especially the Maritimes, is really home for both of us. Marianne glanced at her watch. Heavens, is that the time? I've got to run. I'm meeting Jim's mother in Scodier Square for a last-minute shopping spree. Anne, I'd really like to see you again before I leave. She paused and thought for a moment. Let's have dinner together one evening. How about Wednesday? I'd like to do that. Okay, we can meet at the new Greek restaurant a couple of blocks from here. Around 7? I'll be there. See you then. Bye. Quickly, Anne finished her own meal and hurried back to the hospital. She hung up her coat and went to the washroom to comb her hair. She wore it pinned under her cap while she was on duty. She found she was alone in the room, and as she rinsed her hands, she found herself staring in the mirror at her reflection. How greatly she must have changed for Marianne to not recognize her. She cast her mind back and remembered the Anne of 5 years ago. Her hair had been short then, and for a while she had affected a frizzy afro hairdo. She had even dyed it blonde at one stage. Her fingernails had been very long, painted scarlet. Her makeup had veered on the heavy side. Lots of mascara and eyeshadow had been the younger Anne's idea of sophistication. How young she had been, that girl, and how foolish. In love with her husband, but dazzled by his money, his social position, and by the prestige of being the wife of David Metcalf, the brilliant young defense lawyer. It had all gone to her head, and like a vividly colored butterfly, she had fluttered and danced her way through the days, filling them with pleasure and fun. The other Anne grimaced at herself in the mirror. It had taken a long time for her hair to grow into its present silken smoothness, a warm brown with auburn highlights, after the way she had tortured and frizzed it. Her nails, tipping the same slender fingers, were neatly trimmed and polished a pale pink now. Obvious changes, these. The ones Anne did not fully recognize were more subtle. Her figure was fuller, and she moved with a grace she had lacked in those days. Her face, fined down by the suffering she had undergone, had a mature beauty in the curve of cheek and sweep of dark eyebrow. But it was her eyes that held one's attention. They were chameleon eyes, a smoky grey in some lights, a forest green in others. Always in their depths lurked an incalculable sadness that time had not erased. The locker room door swung open. "Hi, Anne. Can you change Mr. Woodside's dressing for me? He particularly asked for you, and he gets so grumpy if I try to do it." Pinning her cap into place, Anne smiled at the other nurse. "Sure, no problem, although I don't know what's so special about me." The ward, with its myriad duties, soon swallowed her up, giving her no time to brood over the past and all its bitter memories. Jonathan called for her a little before 8. As the bell rang, she was just fastening her earring, a tiny gold loop set with a jade droplet. Jonathan had bought them for her in Toronto. He travelled a lot, because he owned and operated an art gallery in downtown Halifax, dealing only with Canadian artists. She knew he was becoming well known for his flair in discovering new talent, and for his innate good taste. He bent and kissed her. "You're looking very lovely." "Thank you." She had taken trouble with her appearance, perhaps in an obscure desire to banish the memories the day had aroused. She was wearing a full-length skirt of dark green wool, of a simple design, yet a fluidity of line that was very becoming. She had teamed it with a tailored shirt of figured tie silk and a gold necklace. Her eyes gleamed green under her smoothly upswept hairdo. As she put on her second earring, she surveyed Jonathan affectionately. He had been a good friend for well over a year now. He was not much taller than she, stocky in build rather than lean. He was by no means handsome, but his undistinguished features were lit by a kindness and inner integrity that had attracted Anne from the first time she met him. His hair was blonde with a tendency to stand on end. His eyes were his best feature. They were a warm, dark brown, and saw rather more than most people gave him credit for. He took her black evening cloak from the hanger and put it over her shoulders. "Ready?" She peered in her bag. "Have I got my key? Ah, there it is." The play was a delightful Noel Coward comedy. Afterwards they had a cocktail and a light meal in one of the restaurants that overlooked the harbour, where the moon shone slickly on the black water. By the time Jonathan drove her home, it was nearly midnight. Will you come in for a coffee?" she asked, rather hoping he would say no. It had been a long day, and she was tired. "Okay, thanks." As she unlocked the door, she suggested, "Why don't you light the fire in the living room and put on some music while I fix the coffee?" When she entered the living room a few minutes later, he was relaxing in the armchair by the fire, looking very much at home. Anne was proud of her apartment and considered herself lucky to be able to afford it. It was one of the 2 flats on the ground floor of an older home near the hospital, and its windows overlooked hedges and a large garden that in summer was shaded by tall elms. Because the rooms were oddly shaped, they possessed a certain charm lacking in more modern apartment buildings. The atmosphere was comfortable and cozy. But as she added cream and sugar to Jonathan's coffee, she found herself wishing he did not look quite so much at home. For the past few weeks, she had the uneasy feeling that he wanted their easygoing relationship to change in some way. On purpose, she now tried to keep the conversation on trivial subjects, and was chattering away about her new cross-country skis when she happened to look up and find his eyes on her, a quizzical look in their depths. He knew exactly what she was up to. She blushed and fell silent, burying her face in her coffee mug. "Anne," he said quietly, "I want to talk to you." She nodded, unable to think of anything to say. He patted the arm of his chair. "Come over here. You're too far away." Uncertainly, she perched on the edge of the chair, her hands tightly clasped. In an absent-minded way, Jonathan began to fondle them, his dark eyes trained on her face, where the firelight flickered over her creamy skin. "I want to tell you, oh, hell, I rehearsed all kinds of fancy speeches, Anne, but all I want to say is that I'm in love with you." "Oh, Jonathan." "I've been sure of my feelings for some time now. You're a beautiful woman, my dear, beautiful to look at." He stroked a stray wisp of hair that curled against her neck, his hand unsteady. "And just as beautiful inside." He paused expectantly, and she murmured, staring down at their interlocked hands, "That's sweet of you, Jonathan, but—" "Anne, will you marry me?" he blurted. Distressed, she said, "Jonathan, you know I can't. I'm already married. You've known that since we met." "You're not married in any sense but the legal one, and you know it. You haven't even seen the man for 4 years, and you call that marriage?" She tried to lighten the atmosphere. "Just the same, the courts call it marriage, and I don't think I'm cut out to be a bigamist. The courts also have something that they call divorce, and after 4 years it's very easy to obtain. No. The exclamation was torn from her. Why not? Don't tell me you're still in love with your husband. This was the second time today someone had accused her of that. Every fibre of her being rose up to repudiate it. I am not in love with my husband, she said, spacing each word with clarity. But I cannot bear the thought of getting in touch with him for a divorce, or even of ever seeing him again. I hate him, don't you understand? I hate him. Her fingers clenched in the soft fabric of her skirt, and gently Jonathan loosened them. Okay, he said mildly. I believe you. But you don't have to see him, Anne, or get in touch with him directly. It can all be done through lawyers. He'd have to appear in court. Well, I suppose so. I just can't do it, Jonathan. Her breath caught in her throat in a tiny sob. I don't expect you to understand. I'm not sure I understand myself. I only know that I never want to see him again. No, I don't understand. You've never told me what happened between the two of you, or why you split up. I'm trying to forget it, she said in a low voice. So what are you going to do? He persisted, an unusual edge to his voice. Live alone for the rest of your life? Married but not married? You can't condemn yourself to that kind of existence. I've managed very well for the past 4 years, she said with a kind of desperate pride. Sure you have, but that doesn't mean you can continue that way indefinitely. You're young and beautiful and intelligent, and you're capable of great depths of loving. I know that. You don't live like a nun, Anne. Apart from anything else, don't you want to have children? She flinched, as though he had struck her, and a sheen of tears blurred her vision. She had had a child, and the child had died, and because of that, her husband had totally rejected her. Suddenly, it was all too much. She slid to her knees beside Jonathan's chair and began to cry. Great rasping sobs tore at her throat, her shoulders shaking with the intensity of her grief. David, and the baby she had never seen. For a while she had had so much, and now she had nothing. Jonathan held her quietly, his hands gentle on her shuddering form, until gradually her sobbing lessened. He pushed a handkerchief into her hand and said flatly, I'm going to pour you a drink. Stay there. He came back in a few minutes later with 2 brandy snifters, the liquid amber in the crystal goblets. Drink up, he ordered. Anne had blown her nose and wiped her face while he was gone, and now she took a gulp of the brandy, feeling its warmth creep down her throat. That's better, she said shakily. Okay, and now you're going to tell me just what happened 4 years ago, Anne. This was a new Jonathan. He was not normally the dictatorial type. Besides, there was no fight left in her, and he did deserve to hear the truth. I have to start earlier than 4 years ago, she said slowly, staring into the dancing flames. It all started long before that. I think I told you once that my parents came to Canada from England when I was very young. They both died in a flu epidemic when I was 3. There were no other relatives, so I was put in an orphanage, and from there in a series of foster homes. I never felt loved. Nobody really cared what happened to me, and I never had any money of my own. You have no idea how good it feels now, just to have a job of my own and pay my own way. Jonathan got up to put another log in the fire, and idly she watched the sparks shoot up the chimney, their brief, bright light soon extinguished in the blackness. Her happiness with David had been that brief. "So, how did you get in training for nursing?" "That was a stroke of pure luck. My last foster home was by far the best. I went there when I was 16. Mrs. Knowles, I called her Madge, was the head nurse in the children's ward in a hospital in Montreal. At first she got me on their volunteer staff. They had teenagers in to read to the children and play games with them. I loved it so much that she helped me to enroll as a student nurse, and saw to it that I had enough money while I studied. I owe her such a lot. We still write regularly." "But you didn't finish your training there, did you?" "No." Madge was furious. The girl's face softened, lit by an inner light that made Jonathan obscurely jealous. "I met David at the annual Christmas dance. He was on the board of directors at the hospital. And that was that. 2 months later, we were married." "How old were you?" "Not quite 19. She took a sip of brandy and sighed. "Hindsight. It's so easy to look back and see where things went wrong. I loved David, loved him passionately, and we had some wonderful times together. But I was young and flighty, and it all went to my head. His huge house, the servants, the 3 cars, the never-ending social whirl. I loved it all, and somewhere in the excitement, Anne and David got lost. He started going to parties without me, and I started doing the same. Then I heard his name coupled with someone else's, and we had a terrible quarrel. Purely to spite him, I went skiing with his best friend. Jonathan, it all sounds so silly and tawdry now." "But at the time you were badly hurt." "Yes, and frightened too. I think after all the upsets of my childhood, I saw David as security. He was mine. I needed that feeling of security so badly, and suddenly even that was being snatched away. With him gone, I knew I'd have nothing." "That's understandable." "Oh, it is now. But at the time, I don't think I understood what was going on. I just knew I was miserable, and the more miserable I felt, the more I flailed out at him, and the more I filled my life with parties and people and a frantic search for fun. I'd never want to go through that again." She shivered. "I was horribly jealous, too. I couldn't stand to see him with another woman." She shifted her position, her burnished head on Jonathan's knee. "Matters weren't helped by his mother, either. She resented me from the start. She had wanted David to make an advantageous marriage, choosing someone from his own social class, someone with family and money and the right background, instead of which he married a penniless student nurse without a relative in the world, a little nobody from nowhere, and that's a direct quote. Claire frightened me. I used to think she'd stop at nothing to get rid of me." "What did happen in the end?" "I discovered I was pregnant. I kept it secret for as long as I could because we hadn't planned to have children, but his mother found out and told David. I guess she thought it would drive us apart. She was wrong, though. For a while, everything was all right again. He was pleased about the baby, and we were closer together than we'd been for months. But then things began to go wrong again. David withdrew from me, and started doing a lot of traveling when he was home, and made sure there was always lots of people around. I didn't know what was the matter. Finally, about 2 weeks before the baby was due, he announced he had a business trip to the States that he couldn't put off." Her voice trailed away. As though it was yesterday, she was back at the drawing room at David's country house on the shores of the St. Lawrence. She could see the heavy gold curtains, the cream-colored rug, the exquisitely crafted furniture, and she could hear his voice echoing in her ears. "I'm leaving on the early morning flight from Ottawa. "Oh, David, do you have to go now?" "Yes, it's unavoidable." "But the baby's nearly due." He bent his tawny head to light a cigarette, his voice indifferent to the point of insolence. "That's hardly my problem." Anne had never learned to control her temper. "I would have said it was very much your problem." "Do explain why," he said with silky arrogance, his blue eyes like chips of ice, the sensual line of his mouth tight held. Taken aback, she spluttered. "Well, it's your child too." "Is it, my dear?" The colour drained from her face, and unconsciously she gripped the edge of the piano for support. Of course it is. Whatever do you mean?" "You spent a weekend skiing in the Laurentians with Ralph, or have you conveniently forgotten that? It's almost exactly 9 months ago, isn't it?" Appalled, she protested. "David, there was a whole group of us there. You can't be insinuating—" "Insinuating hell!" In 2 swift strides he reached her, gripping her by the arms with cruel fingers. "I'm not insinuating anything. I'm stating it as fact. The child could be mine. It could equally well be Ralph's. For all I know, there might be other possibilities. You weren't around home much then, were you?" "Your mother's been talking to you," she accused, sensing a woman's torturous hand in this nightmare. "Certainly it was my mother who pointed out the coincidence of the dates, but it was I who came to the regrettable conclusion that the child you're carrying might not be mine." "That's a filthy thing to say." "It was a filthy thing to do." She made one last effort, striving to keep the anger out of her voice. "David, I swear to you that nothing ever happened between Ralph and me. I'm sorry I went away with him like that. It was a silly thing to do, but I was angry with you, and I didn't stop to think." "That's the truest word you've said yet. You never do stop to think." His blue eyes, rinsed clear of any emotion except contempt, raked her swollen figure. "Well, you'll have 2 weeks to think about it now, because I guess we'll just have to wait and see, won't we, dear wife, whether your child has black hair like Ralph or fair hair like your husband's. But don't expect me to sit around holding your hand while we do wait." "You're despicable," she shrilled. "I hate you. Do you hear me? I hate you." He shook her, his eyes ablaze with such a primitive surge of fury that she shrank away from him, terrified by the unmasked violence in his face. "I'm beginning to feel that it's entirely mutual," he grated. "How can I feel anything but hatred for a little tramp like you?" For a moment his eyes were anguished. "How could you do it, Anne? How could you?" "I didn't," she said. He released her, running his fingers through his thick blonde hair in a gesture of utter frustration. "I'll be back in 10 or 12 days. My mother will be staying here until I get back, so you won't be on your own." He turned on his heel and strode out of the room, shutting the door behind him with an air of absolute finality. She had not seen him again. The child was born 4 days later. Because she had been too listless and unhappy to take proper care of herself, Anne developed a severe cold which had turned into a mild form of pneumonia. She had a long and difficult labor, and, weakened by her illness, she had been anesthetized for the actual birth. Afterwards, fever and delirium had claimed her, and it was over a week before she fully regained consciousness. When she opened her eyes, the first person she saw was Claire Metcalf, her mother-in-law. The older woman was sitting ramrod straight by the edge of the bed, her immaculately groomed figure bathed in the afternoon sunlight, her lips a thin straight line as she gazed out of the window. Anne let her eyes wander around the room, a neat hospital room with a bowl of daffodils on the dresser. She felt a strange floating sensation, and she had lost all sense of time. It seemed aeons ago that Claire had brought her to the hospital. She flexed her legs, sensing how weak she was. "Claire?" she murmured. The other woman swiveled in the chair. "Ah, you're awake." "What day is it?" "Thursday." "Thursday? But I came here on a Friday. It can't be Thursday." "You've been ill." Claire's manner was so hostile that Anne was repelled. Weakly, she asked, "David, has he been in to see me?" "No." The monosyllable hung in the air. Suddenly, fear struck the girl, fear such as she had never known before. "Is he all right? Nothing's happened to him, has it?" "He's perfectly all right." "Oh." Anne expelled her breath in a long sigh of relief. Her hands were resting on her flat stomach, and in quick delight she asked, "Has he seen the baby? I don't even know what I had. Is it a boy or a girl?" There was a long silence. Claire looked down at her diamond-encrusted fingers, loosely clasped in her lap. "Claire? Please." Panic tightened Anne's voice. "Something's wrong, isn't it? Tell me. Please tell me." With a complete lack of emotion, her mother-in-law said, "The child was stillborn. I told you that you weren't taking proper care of yourself." Only later did Anne recognize the calculated cruelty behind Claire's manner. Now all she could do was gasp. "Dead? You mean the baby's dead?" "Yes." The room began to swirl around her. Fiercely she fought back the wave of dizziness. Was it a boy or a girl?" "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." "If you must know, it was a girl." Anne thrust her fist into her mouth to prevent herself from crying out loud. "David, I need to see David," she begged. Calmly, Claire got up from the chair and walked over to the window, her slim figure silhouetted against the evening sky. "David will not be coming to see you," she said precisely. The girl closed her eyes, fighting for breath. "Why not?" "He asked me to give you a message. He's through with you. Finished. He does not wish to see you again. He'll arrange a monthly income for which will support you in far better style than I feel you deserve. However, that's his business. The gist of his message is that he doesn't want you back. Ever again." In a furious burst of defiance, Anne said, "The child was his." "I'm really not interested in the paternity of your child. My job was to deliver a message, and I've done so." "Didn't he have the courage to deliver it himself?" Anne said bitterly. "I can only assume he preferred not to see you again." Anne swallowed her pride in one last frantic effort. "Claire, I beg of you, tell David I need to see him. I love him, and I'm sure he still loves me. Somehow we should be able to save our marriage." "Very well, I shall tell him. but if I were you, I wouldn't set my hopes too high. Calmly, Claire put on her fur coat and adjusted her hat in the mirror, as though she had just completed a normal social call. As she pulled on her suede gloves, she added, "I don't suppose I shall see you again. David's lawyer will come to the hospital in the next couple of days to make all the necessary arrangements." She turned to face the girl, unable to prevent the glow of triumph in her cold blue eyes. "Goodbye, Anne."